It's a special edition of Capitol View, our year in review. Medical cannabis is now legal. Illinois got a new governor in 2015 and will start the new year without any budget.
We'll talk about all that next on Capitol View.
It's been a terrible, no good, very bad year for the state of Illinois in 2015. We'll see if it gets better next year. I'm Amanda Vinicky, your co-host for this special year in review edition of Capitol View.
And I'm Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues and Illinois Public Radio. And joining us today is Kent Redfield, retired professor of political science with the University of Illinois. Kent, glad you're here.
Good to be here.
Okay, so let's start with the real big news. Rewind back to January 12th, I believe it was when Governor Bruce Rauner was inaugurated, the first Republican that Illinois had had as governor in a dozen years. Professor Redfield, how has that gone?
Well, I think, we started the year with high expectations. The new governor, lots of problems. Let's see if we can, work something out. And I think everybody was on, anticipating something that could be interesting and could have a really good outcome. And, this is
the fast forward part that I was getting to.
Yeah, and now this has been, I've been participating and studying Illinois politics for 40 years. This is the worst performance by a governor and a legislature in all my time in Illinois. This has been a total disaster. We have no budget. We have gridlock on a whole bunch of policy issues and really irreparable damage being done to the state. The city of Chicago, particularly the Chicago public schools, are about to collapse. It has really been, it's really hard to find the good news in the last 12 months.
Worse than when Rod Blagojevich was governor?
The state functioned. We're not talking about an individual's corruption. The legislature worked around him. This time, nothing works. We've had, one major policy accomplishment that kind of relates to what the governor was talking about, which is unemployment insurance, which was an agreement between big business and big labor. Everything else, we're waiting.
And a big deal, but not a huge deal.
No, but it was something that got done that would have an impact on the business climate. And, instead we're just gridlocked over a whole bunch of issues that don't allow us to get to this terrible budget situation that we're in. And the news just kept getting worse, in terms of pensions and a whole bunch of other things as we went through the year. So the inability to deal with this has just been stunning.
Well, and we'll drill into the budget elements later specifically, but Jamey, a lot of this has really been that Rauner, as a candidate, said that initially labor was a big deal, then he moved away from it in the general election and said it isn't a top priority, but it seems as if...
It's clearly emerged as his top priority, it would seem. Every proposal that he has made practically has had some kind of poison pill that would very much anger unions and not fly with Democrats. So it's, no matter what he says, it's hard to deny that it seems that taking power from especially public employee unions is top on the governor's agenda.
And so we've basically gone full half of the year, this actual calendar year, without a contract agreement between AFSCME and the state. That's part of it. The governor is also asking for a rollback of the prevailing wage, collective bargaining on a municipal level. He talked about implementing right-to-work zones, and now that a municipality in just actually this past month has passed that, we could see a court case to determine if that is something that is even legal on a local level or if it has to be statewide, something that the governor keeps on promising. I don't want statewide, I just want to give local control these opt-outs.
Well, when Bruce Rauner came into the office, beyond these sort of ideological and personal conflicts, he brought a lot of things with him that created a very different climate. First Republican governor in a long time, a businessman, someone who didn't have a political history that people could kind of study to know what he might be like as governor, and a ton of money. So all that political cash makes people wary. It's keeping Republicans in line to some degree on their votes, and it's making Democrats really kind of nervous about making a deal with this guy they don't know when they have elections coming up, and he has plenty to spend against them.
It's something that I think I'm going to be watching going forward, is how much Republicans stay with Governor Bruce Rauner. Going forward, he'll continue to have this money. That isn't changing. So is it that they're beholden to him because of it? Is it that they're truly excited to have a Republican and the party needs to stay together because that's where its strengths lies? Or are eventually the lack of budget, and many of them don't have long ties with Governor Bruce Rauner. It's not like they have a relationship built on years past. Are they going to, at any point, break ranks, or will we see more Democrats do that? This was the year of Ken Duncan and a little bit of change up in, I don't know, was that Madigan losing his power at all when one legislator broke ranks?
No, I think we've demonstrated it's very difficult to put together 71 votes in the House, which is what you would need to override the governor's veto. And so the Republicans, I mean, all of those reasons that you listed, the answer is yes. And they're trying to make a difference in terms of this agenda and this huge budget problem. I mean, we started out with a budget that was out of whack for 2015. We did fund sweeps and an agreement that kind of looked like, well, we're talking about all these other issues, but we can still cut a deal and we can get things done. And then that just this tremendous thud at the end of June, where we couldn't get an agreement and where the governor was not willing to address the budget situation. And in terms of the performance, a phony budget from the governor that assumed pension savings that were never going to be in the cards, and some other things that you're not supposed to do when you write a budget. You're supposed to say, here's the revenue we can count on without changing any laws. Here's what I'm going to spend it on. And his budget was out of whack. The legislature then passed a budget that was even more out of balance, and the governor signed a little bit of it and vetoed the rest. And that's basically been the story since August in terms of where we are with this. And so we've got all of these really difficult policy issues. Before we can get to a really difficult budget situation, it's just gone on and on and on.
Well, and Professor Redfield, you make a good point that I want to try to get to, is that as this fight is happening between the Democrats and the governor, all of Illinois' problems continue to tick on and on without solution. That brings us to another one of the big stories of the year, the Illinois Supreme Court ruling on the attempt at pension reform, Senate Bill 1. It was tossed out. Amanda, can you tell us a little bit about what happened with that ruling? That was one of the first big stories of the year after the governor was elected, and it seems so long ago now. Can you remind us what happened there?
Try and think back. It was kind of an interesting memory because you had the whole press corps there in the courthouse, waiting, and everybody is trying to hurry through the opinion and see really what it says. But gosh, was it direct. The justices were pretty darn emphatic that what the legislature had attempted and Governor Pat Quinn was unconstitutional. It says right there that you cannot diminish pension benefits, and that is what this did, because it would have called for state workers to, first of all, work longer before they could retire, and further it ate into the benefits that they would get, even those who are already retired. So we've pretty much seen that stall, though. I mean, that landed with a pretty big thud, creating this huge huge budget issue, and we've seen a little bit of talk about it. Governor Bruce Rauner had a proposal, but there's been no action, really.
Not really. I mean, he's had a proposal. He's modified it a few times. He's saying now that he and Senate President Fullerton have similar views, although I'm not sure that the Senate President would agree with that. Yeah. So we haven't seen a lot of movement. Meanwhile, we've seen the unfunded liability kind of repegged at $111 billion, I think. I don't know, Professor Redfield, what do you think about this? The payments are going to pull back a little in their cost in the coming years. Will there be enough pressure to get something?
Well, the amount that we're putting into it under the law, that in terms of making up the pension payments, it's about leveled out. We're not getting huge increases in what our obligations are, but that still doesn't relieve pressure on the state budget. We have to make a huge payment every year in terms of both the operating and also trying to catch up on pensions. And if we were able to cost shift, say, the cost of pensions to schools, or if we were able to get Tier 1 employees that are currently employed to give up their benefits in some type of consideration situation, both of those would relieve pressure on the budget and make some of these horrendous problems we have with the state wanting to do way more than it can afford with the current revenue structure. We've got a case in Chicago that if the court reaffirms its decision, this involves local pensions in the city of Chicago, court reaffirms its decision that you really can't make changes in people that are currently within the system, then I think the legislature is stuck. I mean, the governor says, well, we can do consideration. We can have a Tier 1 employee. We'll give up future benefits in exchange for something. And most people look at that and see coercion rather than consideration. And so, and what I'm afraid of is we'll pass some kind of pension bill and use the savings for a couple of years, and then it'll get thrown out and we're back in the same places we were before. I mean, these old ways were supposed to go away. We weren't supposed to pay down unpaid bills, not borrow for operating expenses, have honest budgeting, and we've had fund sweeps and we borrowed for operations, and now we may get some phony savings from a pension bill. And so the old ways don't seem to have gone away in terms of dealing with our budget problems.
So yeah, state workers, maybe if you're wondering, you don't like any of your Christmas gifts, think back and pretend that your pension is wrapped in a nice little bow under that tree, and that's what you got in 2015. You get to keep your whole pension. And actually, you touched on the fact that maybe, or not the fact because it hasn't happened yet, that perhaps legislators would be wanting to dip into any sort of potential savings if they did get anything back, but they didn't this time. So that, I guess, is something that fiscal watchdogs should applaud them for this time around. And yet, under Bruce Rauner's recommendation, the tax hike that had passed in 2011 rolled back in 2015. So it's been about a year that most Illinois residents have had more money in their pocket because what was a 5% income tax rate is now 3.75%. Jamey, was it a mistake, do you think, for them to have done that? Would we not be in this historic budget impasse were these extra billions to be rolling in, or is that the pressure that Governor Bruce Rauner needed, and his takeover of the mansion would have been really for naught had that stayed higher?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can say whether it was a mistake or not, but the planning that would have needed to take place for it to happen in a smooth way did not happen. So there would have had to have been some pretty deep cuts made over those years that it was in place to prepare for the step back. And that did not happen. We were starting to, from a budget perspective, gain some stability. As we've already kind of mentioned, bills were starting to get paid down. Our bill cycle was actually getting kind of normal to some degree. I think it was at 60 days at one point, which for Illinois is pretty good. So we were starting to reach a little bit of a level of fiscal stability. And then that revenue went away, and there was no planning for that. And now we're kind of back where we were. It feels like almost when Pat Quinn took over, and we found out that we had, this huge $14 billion or whatever it was deficit at the time. It's not quite that extreme now, but it feels similar as far as the instability and the huge question of how are we going to fix this thing. Clearly, it's going to take some revenue and probably some cuts. It feels like deja vu a bit.
Or maybe even worse, like the deja vu goes to a bit of a nightmare. It's, to me, we would, of course, the budget impasse, the shutdown that wasn't is kind of how I term it, because we are, of course, now 6 months into not having any state budget. Never, of course, happened before. Not supposed to happen that way. The constitutional writers didn't dream that up. And yet there's so much that's being funded right now that you just have a couple of segments. It's almost, I've described it as like Darwinian, where only the strongest are surviving. And higher education, of course, isn't getting any money, and there are some social service areas. But it's such a weird place. You couldn't have fathomed that a budget shutdown would end up in this way, right?
Yeah, most citizens are getting services that we can't pay for because the revenue doesn't meet what we're spending, and then we've got discretionary social service spending, employee health care, and higher education that have gotten no money. We have not processed any bills for state employees in terms of their health care since the 1st of July. So providers, particularly single practitioners that have cash flow situations, are starting to ask for money up front, even though we assume eventually they'll get reimbursed from the state. Students with MAP grants, the monetary assistance program, have been carried by the colleges in some cases not. Lincoln Land, the local community college, is not covering the MAP grants. University of Illinois Springfield and the U of I in general are. And then higher ed has not gotten any money since the first of the year. And the damage here is both, it is hidden unless you're in those populations, and it is also very long term when students leave, when students don't go to college, when people leave universities or faculty don't come on. I mean, those are things that ripple out. Same thing for social services. Agencies go away. Maybe they get replaced later, but the clientele, the people that were supposed to be receiving those services, are not getting those services, and the damage is there. And so it's a very difficult situation. We haven't had that honest discussion about what can the state afford and how are we going to pay for it, because we have to get through the discussion of exactly what are we going to do with the business climate before we talk about what can the state afford and how do we pay for it. And so it's just, you go back and you look at the governor's 43-point 4-year agenda, and there were things in there about reforming the sales tax and covering services and increasing minimum wage, and there's just
trial lawyers' contributions.
There's a lot of things in there. We just haven't, we basically have forfeited, the governor's forfeited the first year of his administration. Anything that we were going to do in agencies about turning them around, about changing them. I mean, it's impossible to believe that agencies where you're paying people but they have no operating budget and real problems when hiring people, that they're delivering services efficiently and effectively or going through, really meaningful management reforms. Everything is frozen.
And as you said, the long-term consequences, it seems, are first the state's reputation, all of this uncertainty after businesses have said for years that's what they want more than anything else. Social services networks are in some cases dismantled, and then who knows how many lives have been affected by not getting those services and the long-term consequences of that.
Well, and while the budget story does overshadow everything in Illinois this year, we do want to make sure that we cover some other topics in the show. Another kind of perennial Illinois news story is rumors of corruption and legal troubles. And we saw some high-profile folks in Illinois this year get into some trouble. Some of them have already pled guilty to some charges. Some have not seen charges yet, but we don't know what will happen. Professor Redfield, looking mainly towards Congress, former Congressman Aaron Schock and former U.S. House Speaker Dennis Hastert both had their share of legal woes this year. What happened? Let's start with Aaron Schock.
Well, I mean, clearly he got into trouble in terms of how the lifestyle he was maintaining within his congressional office. And there seems to be clear misappropriation of funds, not and inaccurate reporting and fraud in terms of expenses. And so what was a rising star at the national level, and they had just moved to the Ways and Means, was a big fundraiser for people in other congressional districts, suddenly, just crashed and burned. And the Hassert story, as former Speaker of the House, is a personal rather than a political corruption. But again, someone who has held a constitutional office that puts you about third in line to be president of the United States. If you have a disaster, suddenly you find that this person, had a terrible, character flaw and committed crimes in terms of, when he was a coach. And so, we continue to indict congressmen and the legislature, I think at one point we had at least 3 sitting members of the General Assembly under indictment. Now, not all of them got convicted, but we just sentenced someone, and we're talking about whether, we can. Whether you can still get your pension when you've been convicted before you're sentenced, and only in Illinois do you have these conversations. But it is pretty amazing, given the level of corruption, that we kind of the incompetence of the state kind of push corruption off of the front page, which is hard to do in terms of Illinois.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I see it as Hastert. It's pretty remarkable that it was, as you said, it's not at all connected. It was actually tax evasion, but there are accusations that it was a payoff to somebody with whom he'd had underage relations with somebody who was underage, that he was trying to, keep this a secret. But it was a fall from grace, really tarnishing his legacy. And we have found out that he actually has had a stroke. And I mean, nobody even knew it because he hasn't been talking to the press, obviously. And then with Schock, he didn't even really have a legacy yet. His legacy was this rising star, so young, had traveled the world, seemingly, had everything. The world and the political world especially was his oyster. And then it was gone really before it even began. He hadn't done or accomplished much.
No, but the profile that he had cultivated was what got him so much attention, and it also, it seems, led to his downfall to some degree, as far as him, having this Instagram account where he's doing all these flashy things. Yes. And just really being out there in the public face, and then people kind of started asking questions about how is he paying for these things and why is he here and so
everywhere.
Yeah.
And having really seemingly a great time.
Yeah, so the things that made him popular were also the things that kind of led to him getting busted out a little, perhaps, and ultimately resigning from his position.
And then that's not the only corruption. There's also Jesse Jackson Jr. is now a free man, at least somewhat. I think he's still being watched. And then we also had the Chicago Public Schools former superintendent Barbara Byrd Bennett is going to be on trial. She's actually said, yeah, I took money that was supposed to be, that she was basically paid off by a program that was supposed to train principals, and instead put it into her own bank account to seemingly help her own kids after they got a great education. Her grandkids go to university. And then lots of troubles for Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who in 2015 was reelected, and then shortly thereafter got into some trouble after this is sad, a teenager shot 16 times by a police officer, and it took a while and actually a FOIA request from an independent journalist for that to be released, and it's caused some major issues. Jamey, I know that this is something that even before that, the state legislature had begun tackling this issue of shootings, violence, what to do about that, and also body cameras for police.
Absolutely. I mean, after we saw the cases in Ferguson and in Baltimore, lawmakers in Illinois wanted to do something to bring another level of transparency to policing, and they passed legislation that will regulate the use of body cameras. It doesn't require police departments to use them, but if they are going to use them, it sets out the rules for using them properly and making sure that they store the video and that it can be made public if there is some sort of incident or problem. It also has reporting requirements because one of the things that has kind of come out of a lot of these stories and the protests that have followed and the advocacy is that police departments across the country really don't have uniform reporting requirements for what happens when they do use force or, heaven forbid, have to shoot someone or do shoot someone in a situation when they maybe shouldn't have. So this lays out some rules for that as far as departments having to report those incidents in a uniform way in the state.
In a different year, this is part of criminal justice reform that was bipartisan, that we started to do some things with trying to get at reducing the prison population. And that is actually a national movement that Illinois is part of, that we're rethinking about having way too many people in prison, and how do you deal with not getting them into prison or getting them out and back into the community. And that would be, that's something that really positive the legislature did and the governor signed. And again, that would be a much bigger story in a different year, because it's actually taking a real policy problem and getting some solutions to it.
And another top story for the year is not legislation that passed or budget woes. It's actually from legislation that has already passed in a program that kicked off. Illinois' medical marijuana pilot program is finally up and running. It took a while to get it going, but we're seeing business sprout up around the state. It's very hard to not hit those puns on that. Amanda, what's the reception been of the medical marijuana pilot program? It's maybe not going as well as people had hoped.
Yeah, this still might fit into the category of no good, very bad in terms of implementation, because as you noted, Jamey, it took so long to get up and running that the clock is winding down. It's only supposed to be a pilot program. And further, legislators, in order, I think, to get it passed, the sponsor, Lou Lang, really had to make sure that this legislation was, as he termed it, the toughest in the nation, making it so that there are some patients that are having a hard time finding a doctor who's actually willing to write the prescription for medical cannabis. And then you also have the issue of some people don't want to go through the background checks and all that is required in order to be able to get this, special ID card that says that you are somebody who qualifies. It's also been difficult. Governor Bruce Rauner doesn't seem to be a big fan of this, and so he hasn't wanted to add on to the list of qualifying illnesses. And so really, a lot of the companies that got into this that thought they were going to make a big buck instead are looking like it may in fact be the opposite. So the program may die before it begins?
Yeah, that's the big question is there going to be enough patients to kind of sustain the business that is growing up around this? And it needs to be renewed in a couple years. Will lawmakers want to kind of put their necks out on that, knowing that the governor might veto it? So there's a lot of uncertainty for these businesses that are taking off right now, and for the patients. Don't forget about the patients who are counting on this medicine that they had been obtaining illegally and fearing for going to jail and that kind of thing. It's going to be hard to take that back from people.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's going to be one of the stories we'll be following in 2016. Of course, the budget. Will Governor Bruce Rauner and the legislature fare better in the new year? Will they do anything with sentencing reform? How about another sin, gambling? Is that going to get expanded? There's so much to follow, and Capitol View will be with you. I'm Amanda Vinicky, the State House Bureau Chief for Illinois Public Radio and WUIS.
And I'm Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues and Illinois Public Radio, and we'd like to thank our guest, Kent Redfield, and we'd like to thank you all for being with us in this wild year of Illinois news, and I'm sure it'll be just as interesting in 2016, so we'll see you next year on Capitol View.